Well, welcome to Move to Amend. I look forward to working with each of you over the next several months. Move to Amend is different than many other social action organizations in a number of distinctive ways. Unlike most other groups that seek change through elections or changing legislation or regulation, we're calling for amending the Constitution, believing that changing the players of the game, that being elections, or the plays of the game, that being legislation or regulation, won't do very much if the rules of the game are rigged or fixed to benefit the super rich and corporations. The basic governing rules of our society, of course, is established in our Constitution. Move to Amend is working to amend the U.S. Constitution much more fundamentally than other constitutional reform groups. We don't simply believe that the Citizens United 2010 Supreme Court decision should be overturned, or that the 1976 Supreme Court decision called Buckley versus Vallejo that established money as free speech should be overturned, though they both should definitely be overturned. We believe that in addition, that scores of Supreme Court decisions granting and expanding all constitutional rights for corporations should end, among many other changes needed to democratize the U.S. Constitution. One set of these corporate constitutional rights that need to change, that need, in fact, to end, to be abolished, in fact, deals with elections. This is specifically First Amendment free speech rights that corporations first won in the 1970s, which permitted corporations to spend money to influence elections through political, some people call contributions, but what may more accurately be described as political investments to candidate campaigns and independent so-called issue ads. But there are many other constitutional rights that have been won by corporations through the courts that came before and have come since these free speech First Amendment rights to influence elections. And these rights are just as undemocratic and lethal, if not more so, to the right of we the people to create justice in all their forms, sustainability in all of its forms, and peace. All of these corporate constitutional rights were originally intended to apply just exclusively to human beings, some of whom were historically oppressed. Like all corporate constitutional rights, these were never voted on by the public or our elected representatives, but granted by what can be called as nothing less than activist Supreme Courts for more than a century, and that includes right up to the present time. So here are the major non-First Amendment political free speech rights that we need to be mindful of that complete the picture of the assaults to our democracy that come from granting corporations constitutional rights. The first is Fourth Amendment search and seizure rights. Corporations have used these rights to avoid subpoenas, for example, for unlawful trade and price fixing, and to prevent citizens, communities, and regulatory agencies from stopping corporate pollution and other assaults on people or the commons. Protecting workers and the environment has been blocked by corporations who use the Fourth Amendment and continue to use the Fourth Amendment as, if you will, a shield from having their corporate property inspected. Fifth Amendment takings rights are one of several aspects of the Fifth Amendment, that being what's called quote-unquote takings rights that fall under this realm. Corporations must be compensated, as the courts have decided, again, numerous times, for property value lost, what the court has deemed as future profits that has been lost when regulations are established to protect homeowners, communities, the environment, so be it. So, for example, if a community wants to prohibit, say, mining in a community, a corporation can sue that community claiming that they need to be compensated for the value of the minerals or the substance that was prevented from being mined. Well, what community can afford that when you're talking about millions or tens of millions potentially of dollars worth of unmined, unplundered resources underground that communities want to leave in the ground to protect the health, safety, and welfare of their community? 14th Amendment, due process and equal protection corporate rights, are another set of rights that have been won by corporations. These rights, originally enacted to free slaves from oppression, were gradually extended to corporations by, again, the courts, particularly the Supreme Court. Corporations have used these rights to build chain stores and erect cell towers against the will of communities, to oppose tax and other public policies favoring local businesses over multinational corporations, and to resist democratic efforts to prevent corporate mergers and revoke corporate charters through citizen initiatives. The Commerce Clause related corporate rights are another example. Corporations have used this section of the Constitution, that's Article 1, Section 8, for example, to ship toxic waste from one state to another over the health, safety, and welfare objections of communities, claiming that this waste isn't actually waste, poisons, or toxins, but actually commerce, and therefore should be protected under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. The courts have gone along with that. It should be noted that the combined 14th Amendment and Commerce Clause, those two anti-democratic hammers, if you will, have been effectively and were effectively used hundreds of times a century ago to overturn democratically enacted laws at the state level protecting workers, consumers, and communities. Well before Citizens United was passed, well before corporations ever were granted First Amendment political free speech rights. The Commerce Clause related corporate rights is another example. The Supreme Court ruled in the early 19th century that a corporation is nothing more than a party in a private contract based on the Contracts Clause of the Constitution, rather than being an entity of public law. Now, even though the state creates a corporation when it issues a charter, the Supreme Court ruled otherwise, claiming that the state is not sovereign over the charter, even though the state created the corporation through the charter, but merely that a corporation, by having a charter, is merely a party to a contract. Thus, corporations became private contracts with the state and therefore sort of equal, not subordinate to the state, to government, but on equal par, and thus shielded from many forms of direct control by we the people. And lastly, corporations have been granted a variety of other First Amendment non-political free speech rights. It's not just the right to speak that corporations have used and abused. They've used the First Amendment commercial rights to advertise for guns, tobacco, and other dangerous products over the objections of communities. They've used the First Amendment right not to speak, to avoid having to label genetically modified foods or toxins on products. And even as of 2014, corporations won religious rights, First Amendment, that's a part of the First Amendment, in the Hobby Lobby decision, in what not the owners, but the corporation was granted religious rights to deny employees health coverage. So corporations have won a variety of non-First Amendment political rights to trump, if you will, no pun intended, the rights of communities to decide, the rights of people to have health care provided as other employees have. Now, much of this can understandably be mind-numbing and intimidating. I get it. But it's essential that we understand the breadth of corporate constitutional rights so as not to be misled into thinking that the problem begins and ends simply with corporate money and elections. That's a big problem, to be sure, no question about it. But if that's all we do to work on and believe is the problem, then we'll never be able to get at all of these other never intended constitutional rights that corporations should have never been granted with in the first place, and by being granted with, have been able to usurp or hijack or run around the right of we the people, the right to decide that we and those like us in our communities have. So a partial solution, therefore, is insufficient. Just dealing with money in politics via corporate constitutional rights isn't enough. We need, as Move to Amend advocates in the We the People Amendment, to work for, to educate, to advocate, and to organize ending all never intended constitutional rights for corporations.